Hi, welcome everyone to Design in Mind, where we have conversations on everyday creativity, life design, social innovation, and the mindsets that support them. I'm your host, Bridget, and today I am thrilled to be able to introduce our guest, Jack Donovan, also my father. Welcome, Dad.
Good to be here, Bridge.
Thank you for joining us.
Yes.
I'm so excited to get to share some of your background today, Dad, as well as so many of the insights that I think you have in the space of social innovation and also life design, and just bringing that creativity to everything that you do. A little, just to give everyone some background. So you are a minister, very focused in community development, social service, just to kind of, I mean, there's just so much here in terms of your background, but you have, started off at Dartmouth College, then got your master's in public policy at the JFK School of Government at Harvard, and then went on to your master's of divinity to be a minister, studying theology at Berkeley. Then you went on to be in the Peace Corps, volunteering in the Peace Corps in the Pacific Islands of Micronesia, as a teacher and organizer, and the list just goes on and on. I mean, that's early life, right? And then you went on to be a chaplain for hospice. You went on to be a commissioner for the city, working in Gainesville, Florida for Alachua County. Your work for the Coalition for Homelessness and Hunger, as the executive director when you were in Gainesville. I mean, there's the list goes on and on, all the while also being a minister for a range of churches and building up those communities and helping them to grow as well. So that's just the start of it. I mean, I feel like that's really just kind of high level of the iceberg of so much of what you do. But I'd love for you to kind of tell us more on your story of kind of how you got to be here, where you are today, and building such an impactful kind of journey and career.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that introduction, Bridge. I think I've been really one of the lucky people. Just the way you're born, you get wonderful parents if you're lucky, and their life goes well. Both of my parents, one of your grandmothers and one of your grandfathers, were really wonderful contributors to the community. And for the kids, it was picking strawberries on the local farms in the morning in the summertime and playing baseball all afternoon, and then going swimming in the later afternoon. So it was pretty lucky, pretty fortunate kind of childhood. I then off to college, which was great. I don't think I had no sparks struck. I had this romantic image of one day being the great American novelist a la Ernest Hemingway. Later on, I did try that for several years. I stopped working, sold my house and all that, and tried to write the great American novel, which I did not succeed in doing. But it was, you got to follow your dream sometimes and put some time into it until it's clear that dream isn't going to work out, and then you choose a new direction. The career changes were all positive. I came out of college during the Vietnam War time, and one day I guess it was my junior year in college, I had decided I'd really had enough of college, and I decided that I wanted to work in the theater in New York. So I was on the baseball team. I told my teammates I was leaving, and they said, well, we'll drive you down to New York. And we only got as far as Skidmore College when we met some women from the college there, and they said, well, what about getting drafted? And I said, oh, drafted into what? And this was 1964 or 5. And they said, there's a war going on. And I kind of knew that, but it just shows you kind of how dense I was in this sort of semi-ivory tower place. So back to college, finished college. um, and then into the Peace Corps. Some of my Peace Corps friends introduced me to some of the books that had been written by that time about why we were in Vietnam. Um, and I began to see that there was a whole bunch of stuff I didn't know much about. So I think I became a lifelong learner at that point, and that's been a real blessing. And they gave me the 2 books, and one of them was Why We Are in Vietnam by the historian Howard Zinn, um, whose son-in-law now is a very important figure in my own world, John Kabat-Zinn, who is
Oh,
a teacher of meditation and a really fine researcher at the University of Massachusetts.
wow.
But yeah, so I read Zinn, I started reading other books, and I came to realize, well, you know, I really, once again, got a lot to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And what I can learn is to be a lot more helpful.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting how that theme of the more we learn, the more we're open to learning and understanding, the more helpful we can be as an individual.
Yeah, I think that's really true.
Yeah. Is that what made you go to Vietnam to work with USAID?
It was I had an American friend living at the far end of the island where I lived, and we would get together periodically for a visit. And he had a friend who was stopping on his way back from Vietnam, a friend who worked for USAID, who would stop in Truck, the Truck district of Micronesia, to visit Bill, my friend, and Bill would always invite me down to meet this guy, talk with this guy, and the stories he was telling about the richness of the culture, the desperateness of the war, all the consequences of what was going on. I just finally felt like, well, you know, I got to be a voice for about that, and if I can't be a voice if I haven't actually seen it.
Right.
So yeah, I don't think I would have ever thought of it if he hadn't said what he did, which was to work with refugees.
Mm-hmm.
But a whole year of language training in intensive sessions made me able to do my work in Vietnamese. And so I got to see and have a sense, person to person, a sense of the culture that moved me a great deal, to see the predicament they were in, trying to survive in the middle
Mm-hmm.
of some pretty powerful and deadly forces.
Yeah.
The city of Hue had rockets showered on it every night, and the outlying villages had rockets going back from the Americans. So it was sort of like the Israeli-Palestinian situation right now, and has been for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of disconcerting to know that your city is going to be, as soon as the sun goes down and people can move around in the dark, someplace in your city will be hit by rockets.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting that you said that as soon as you heard about it, you wanted to give a voice to it, but it's sometimes hard to have a voice to before really knowing full for yourself, seeing and seeing what's going on, which I feel like you see that right now with the spread of information. A lot of times it's good in that we're getting informed and updated, but it's so easy for misinformation to go around. But just to be there and actually see what was going on for yourself, I think that's obviously an extreme version, but it's such a good example when we see something that we care about and we want to give it a voice, is how can I get more informed? If I really care about this, how can I get more informed about it? How can I make sure that I'm coming from a place of true knowledge, true understanding, to then actually make a difference.
Yeah, yeah.
You saw it. I mean, you were there.
Yes, and I think being exposed to the different cultures of the world and seeing how good they can be for people, but also how much oppression can happen within that system
Yeah.
is is really helpful. So my Peace Corps experience in the Pacific Islands and my time in Vietnam and a summer in Mexico gave me just an absolute love of other people's cultures. And even coming back to Boston when I started working for the Poverty Agency in Boston, I it was I sort of saw it almost through the eyes of an anthropologist. I was being introduced to other ways that people lived that they were often impoverished lives as far as material things, but quite rich in terms of personal connection. And all of that sort of um, moved me a lot. Um, uh, and really, I really just wanted to work on poverty issues at that point in my life,
Mhm.
and that's why I went back to graduate school. Um, uh, but it turned out that graduate school really didn't teach me that much about poverty. It taught me a lot about economics and quantitative analysis and political systems. Poverty program had sort of, in my view, dried up by the time I got out. So I ended up as a consultant and then trying to write my novel and ended up finding ministry as an important parallel path. I think that spiritual growth is something that I had not grown up knowing much about. I didn't know it was something to actually work on in your life. It took me a long time to learn that.
Mhm.
And I think that's what I've been working on ever since. It's led me into all kinds of poverty and justice work, but the core work of my life has been learning how does a person develop spiritually? What can other people do to encourage and help that?
I mean, now I know you as someone who's extremely aware of the different factors that go into poverty and extremely involved in all of the communities that you're a part of. But was there a time when you were younger that you first knew this is something that I want to be a part of? This is something that matters to me, that I want to make a difference.
Um, well, I think so I, there are some things that you are shaping you that you don't even know
Mhm.
are part of your life. Uh, you're not consciously aware of being shaped by them. But as I look at my parents and the wider family, they all had a social justice orientation. I think in part it was um, being of Irish heritage, still talking about why did people immigrate from Ireland to America? How were we received, which was not well. Um, Boston was famous for its sign saying, help wanted, no Irish need apply. Um, that, that, I never felt those negative experiences myself, but I was made aware growing up of that history. Even in a placid, well-to-do community like Concord, my parents were raising them up to me saying, this is unjust, that's not fair, this should be changed. They
Mhm.
weren't complainers, they were just observers and doers. My mom was a member of the League of Women Voters, very active, a member of her Catholic Women's Guild, um, mainly raised us kids, but she did substitute teaching when we got older and would go into Boston and work in the Boston schools and come back with stories um, and do really neat things for the kids there. Was one school that didn't have any books in its whole library. So she got the League of Women Voters and the Catholic Women's Guild to start collecting books and raising money, and they supplied that whole library. So things like that that I became aware of and realized, yeah, it takes a village to care about its community.
Yeah.
Everybody has to have a part. but one person can start a ball rolling.
Mhm.
And I saw lots of people take initiatives like that. And it's a very challenging thing
Mhm.
to get out of your box,
Yeah.
because mainly, certainly, I think it's been true for me for a number of decades. I didn't know there were any boxes to be in,
Yeah.
much less that I was in one.
Mhm.
Um, if I was going to be the great novelist, the great American novelist, that meant I was the omniscient author. You know, I already knew everything,
Yeah.
which turned out not to be quite true. But I think it wasn't really until just after one of the things one of my professors at the Kennedy School used to say, and this guy won a Nobel Prize in economics for game theory um, a, a decade after I had finished there, but he was great. He was always saying, ask questions.
Mhm.
There's nothing as powerful as a question. Your
Mhm.
answers may be powerful, but your questions will be more powerful.
Mhm.
Kept repeating that. And um, that has become kind of a mantra for me, even as a minister.
Yeah.
Um, some people will come to our congregation thinking, "Oh, I'll get some answers
Mhm.
here to some life struggle," but really, and that can happen because we have all kinds of group conversations where you might be listening to somebody talking about their struggle, and they're providing the answer as they talk to your struggle. Um, um, but then intentional study of the great world's traditions. There are answers out there that you have to have the question first in
Mhm.
order to recognize an answer as being helpful. But how to discern between the falsehoods and the misrepresentations in your own mind as well as others?
Mhm.
That's a tough
Right.
one.
Yeah.
I remember an old girlfriend that she was working in the same place that I did at a consulting firm. We were doing work for HUD and HEW, Department of Labor, um, on a variety of projects. And I must have been saying something one day, and she said, you're a very conservative thinker. I was shocked, and I had to go do a whole reassessment because this was a person who I thought was brilliant. And she was the first person I think I've ever had who said directly, "You're kind of off base." Well, I guess my friends in the Peace Corps who said about Vietnam, I guess that was other than parental, no, no, Jackie, that's not right kind of stuff. But it was the first friends that ever said, "You better rethink that, kid." You know that. And that takes courage on the part of a friend.
Yeah.
Um, they were skillful in doing it. I mean, how much more gentle can somebody be than to say, "Hey, I got a book you should read."
Mhm.
And in fact, that's what the woman did. She said, "I think you should read um, the work of Lawrence Kohlberg and his team at Harvard on the moral and intellectual development of college students."
Interesting.
And she also directed me to a book by a, a sociologist and his co-worker, Sennett and Cobb, I think were their names. I later learned that Sennett was quite a remarkable sociologist, written a book called The Hidden Injuries of Class. Those two books built upon a lot of stuff I'd already seen, but they gave me a framework for understanding it in depth. And it was because of the kindness of friends to say, you know, you could use a little consciousness raising here. Um, but they did it in such a gentle way by offering books. They didn't become my teacher or mentor, but they gave me a path to follow if I wanted to follow it,
Yeah.
which I did.
So, and that's interesting because I think a lot of times when you think of consciousness raising, well, it's interesting because before you brought up bringing spirituality into your life, and that's often a route to go. So how did that did kind of the intellectual side of having these books and knowledge introduced to you for a raising of consciousness, did that kind of work with your then kind of more spiritual path, or did they go together, or did that come later? Do you see a relation between the two?
Well, the common link is again friendship.
Mm.
Um, and it was while I was at the seminary, the School for Ministry in Berkeley. There is a consortium of seminaries called the Graduate Theological Union that it surrounds the Berkeley campus. Back in, I think, 1906 or 8, when the University of California was being established at Berkeley, it had a huge swath of land. And the first president of the university said, okay, we're going to be all about the humanities and the sciences, but we should have a religious influence here. And he talked the state legislature of California into designating all the land that circled the campus, which was quite huge, to be given free to any religious group that wanted to establish a seminary. So it ended up being, I think, 10 seminaries, including a Unitarian Universalist seminary, which is the one I went to in Berkeley, but I was considered, just like everybody is, free to go to any of the other seminaries in the Graduate Theological Union. So I took half my classes in these other places. Well, that was kind of a huge influence, but one day in one of our classes, a friend of mine named Dan, beloved by all of our class members, just said, I'm going over to the Green Gulch Zen Center Saturday morning. They have an all morning meditation period with interspersed with walking and sitting meditation and a lecture, a Dharma talk, he called it. He said, I think some of you would love it. So we all went, and it was a beautiful, exquisite spot right on the ocean north of San Francisco, with gardens that the students at the Zen Center maintain, going right down to the ocean. And I was really quite taken by the experience to sit in silence from 8 o'clock till 10 o'clock, and then to hear a Dharma talk with a person talking about how do you look at your own mind? How do you deal with the hungers and fears that are always distracting you? And I'm thinking, hungers and fears distracting me? I don't think so. Then I sit for an hour and I see, oh my God, the guy knows what he's talking about. And then back to meditation, and then noontime, we all go home. Well, it turned out I was living just down the block from the Berkeley Zen Center. And another friend pointed that out to me. I don't know if I ever would have discovered that, because my life was go to school, come back home and study, go to school, come back home and study. And it ended up for a year and a half, I would go down the street, just 2 blocks, to the Berkeley Zen Center every morning, a little before 7 o'clock, and I would sit for 40 minutes or 50, I forget which it was, and then go to school. And the teacher was always there helping. He just, by the way, passed away at age 93. A notice came through Mindfulness Magazine about that. But I gradually came to see that even though my brain was always actively sending sort of, it's almost like the brain is saying, you interested in this, interested in that, want to worry about this, want that? That's its job, to keep me sort of alert, but it also distracts me from whatever I want to pay attention to.
Mhm.
And I was gradually learning I can increase the amount of time where I'm focused on what I want to focus on and decrease the amount of time not turning off the brain mechanism that keeps me sort of awake to the wider world, but controlling it such that it doesn't sweep me away anymore. The
Mhm.
thought or feeling can come in. I can say, oh, there's that thought or feeling. I don't really need to deal with that right now. Let's stay focused on what is important. Um, and over time, I gradually came to realize that those thoughts and feelings coming in weren't just unrelated to me, they were me, but they were a part of me that was on automatic pilot and could be put under not automatic pilot. I could be the pilot of my own mind. Um, and I could even get to a point where I could see underneath watching my breath come and go, or staying focused on working at my desk or being in conversation with somebody else. I could see the energy flow underneath it, or I could sense it. Seeing might not even be the right word, but sense it. Um, and more recently, I've gotten really quite captivated by an idea that's kind of coming from physicists talking to psychologists, talking to mindfulness teachers. And some people are all three at one time, amazingly. Um, they're talking about um, let's see, uh, informed energy or energy information. Sort of, they go back and forth, it seems, between which way to phrase that they prefer. And related to that is informed matter. So if energy slows down, it becomes matter, and matter retains some of that information, some of that creative power, or creative insight, and the matter itself has the power. Um, and I just love that kind of new way of thinking about what I am. That
Mhm.
I am matter informed with information, um, or I'm information informed with matter. Your choice. Uh, but it is a flowing kind of thing that I can sort of almost like a quantum field, I can pause and create a particle that is me at that moment in time, interacting with everything else that has paused at that moment in time. It, when I was in the seminary, I had a classmate who made the rest of us study process theology, and I'm forever grateful to him because process theology emerged out of the intersection of theologians starting to pay attention to physics
Mhm.
right around 1910, 1920, as Einstein was coming up with relativity theory, and um, Alfred North Whitehead and other mathematicians and philosophers were starting to play with and Nels Bohr with quantum theory. Um, that started to have a huge impact on how we understood who we were, and as a consequence, what was spiritual life. Um, that and now the neurologists are carrying that a huge dimension further. So it's just been a fascinating journey, all of which I felt, I don't feel like I've always used it in a totally enlightened way, but it's a gradual awakening, as
Mhm.
the writer Stephen Levine put it. And each, and sometimes you'll look back and say, "Wow, I wish I knew that sooner. Would have saved me a lot of trouble." But and other people trouble too. But still, there's that gratitude that yes, I just learned something new.
Mhm.
That's a great feeling.
Um, so you mentioned that after all of these experiences, you realized that one of your core works in life was to better understand how does a person develop spiritually And what can other people do to encourage that?
Yep.
What does that look like to you? I know that's a big question, but kind of at a high level.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people use language that is coming out of one camp or another, maybe one religious tradition, or from religious traditions in general, or a psychological tradition or philosophical tradition. But it seems that they all have um, dimensions of growth in life, and sometimes they describe them as steps or stages in life. So in the Catholic tradition, you have 7 sacraments, and they are actually sort of incremental. They keep building on each other, starting with baptism and communion, and then so on up to vocation and marriage and sort of older age. Hindu tradition has almost exactly the same thing. Psychology talks about, if it's Eric Erickson, it's the different crises people go through, but those crises could sort of in the way of Lawrence Kohlberg or Carol Gilligan, they can be seen as potentials for development. And that's the way I'd like to see it. I see humans having a sequence of values that we develop in the course of our lives. With pretty much every 7 years, there's a new set of growth opportunities that we don't really have the potential for in the previous 7 years. Sort of independent thinking, for example, has becomes much richer in our teens. But in some cultures, that opportunity is actually somewhat squelched because custom is such a strong bind, or dogma. Well, custom sometimes, dogma sometimes. But you always meet some people in that culture that have grown beyond that. They have, and how do they do that? They've gone from the family intimacy of childhood, where that's your world, those are your relationships. And spirituality is essentially about how well do you relate in this dimension? How well do you relate to yourself? How well do you relate to your family? How well do you relate to your community? How well do you relate to your nation or your people and your world? And I think spirituality ends up, and ultimately with whatever you consider the source of existence, call it Brahman, or God, or Yahweh, or the source, or the force. But something that people think of almost as divine, but it can be the divinity of Mother Nature that operates under scientific laws, or it could be a more traditional theological divinity that has its own plan. But if you look at the 10 Commandments, for example, they're all pretty much based in what allows a community of people to survive well. Don't kill each other, don't steal each other's mates, don't steal each other's properties, those kinds of things. And ultimately, don't be idolatrous. Which simply really comes down to don't mistake what's foolish for what's important.
Yeah.
But what all of that comes down ultimately is, it's all about relationship with self, others, and all, or source. The question is, how well do you understand, and how much do you care? So there are all kinds of levels of understanding that we go through as we go through those stages of life. And the understanding of a child, of course, is, as poetry and philosophy and religion all say, it's much different than, when I was a child, I thought as a child. When I was fully mature, I thought with wisdom. And yet the child might see something unique that another prior generation didn't have the conditions to see. It's sort of like the emperor has no clothes sort of thing. The little kid comes along, is not conditioned to see the king as the be all and end all, and right away says, How come that bloke isn't wearing clothes? You know, and a revolution happens. So it can all play back upon itself. But the two things are understanding the nature of your relationships, and what works best for them, for the well-being of whoever you care about. Then the second thing is caring. So it's understanding and caring. You can understand something, but if you then don't become active and care for it, what good is the understanding? It so happens that understanding often leads to caring. Once you understand you're interconnected with other people, other creatures, you're much more likely to reach out and try and make a difference.
It's interesting that when you kind of look at your work, you talked about working with this innate human design that's already there, and that part of that design is that growing and continuing to learn and evolve. And that at the core of that is kind of understanding and caring. I love that because I feel like it relates so much to the world that I'm in of, design and innovation, where really being able to understand what's going on around you and the people that you are designing or building for, like that's how you problem solve. That's how you create something new and amazing and impactful. And empathy in my world of design and innovation, empathy is talked about a lot. It's not always implemented or kind of used well. And from my conversations with you and from kind of my own life experiences, mindfulness, which you talk about a lot and which you practice a lot and have for a long time, that to me seems like a really core thing to being able to better understand and to be able to actually truly build empathy. And the other thing you touched on too with in building that awareness was also experience. So actually getting out there and kind of trying it for yourself, learning for yourself. But also you mentioned all of these books that folks recommended to you along the way, if maybe you weren't completely aware in that stage of your life, but being open to that new set of information.
Yep. Yeah, what was interesting about those experiences for me was the people who I was talking with and sort of revealing my own ignorance without knowing it, thinking I was saying something that was reasonable. Their kindness was an interesting aspect of their response. They knew what I didn't know. I mean, I think they really actually knew it, but they didn't tell me what they knew. They suggested that I add other sources of information to my understanding. And after a while, I knew what they knew. And I knew why they had suggested this to me, whether it was, and it happens even to really, esteemed people. I like the example of Lawrence Kohlberg, the Harvard psychologist who made huge inroads in thinking about developmental psychology and how the spirit, the personality, the moral development develops in a human being. But along comes a graduate student named Carol Gilligan, who is, a wonderful student and all that. And she's seeing his testing model, the test by which he would rank the level of moral maturity or development of a person. Women always scored lower. And so Carol Gilligan's going like, wait a minute, women are less moral than men? Now there's an inversion of what the culture has actually thought. Well, it wasn't, it turns out, what a patriarchal part of our culture thought. They kind of assumed, men are more intellectually, morally developed. So she starts doing research and finds out that the only subjects that Kohlberg did his research on were men. Wait a minute, that's not a good research model. So she expanded it and discovered that there's, and people have added to this, so it's not the be all and end all as far as theory, but men tend to base their moral decisions on sort of a rule of law that equates to justice. Women are, and Gilligan went on to say, it's more conditioning than it is innate propensities. Women tend to base their judgments on what is good and what is bad, moral decision making, on the quality of caring as opposed to justice. Their instinct isn't that everybody is treated fair so much as everybody is treated so nobody will be harmed, and you take care of those people. It's actually more of a call to action than justice might be, because justice tends to be more in the head as opposed to the heart. I think that's the kind of wake-up call. And Kohlberg, once she presented that to him, when she had become a colleague by that time, he pretty much said, well, I'll be darned. You're right, you know. And the model expanded. So it's that kind of growth experience that even the more intellectually developed of us can come to when somebody shows us we're in too small a box. Mm-hmm. And the relationships of the world are quite a bit more involved than we were acknowledging within the box we're in. So,
if someone wanted to kind of create that that next level awareness themselves, what are some ways that you've seen that were some of the most effective ways to increase awareness, to be able to see these opportunities for growth and learning?
I think it really helps if your culture, whether it's your family culture or your network of friends or your school or your wider community, has an expectation that they communicate to you that you'll keep growing all your life. That is not necessarily built into our American culture or educational system. We often seem to blame people when they're not doing well at a particular stage of life. That, I think that's a real important start for every person. If they start off with a growth advantage, if they have a family that doesn't blame them for falling short, but presumes there's an educational opportunity there, another teaching opportunity, as we say.
And that, I think, really aligns beautifully with Carol Dweck's research on the growth mindset and cultivating an environment for the growth mindset that supports a growth mindset.
Yep, and the research on parenting styles points in that direction very strongly. Then I think the two of the things that have been very important to me are, well, three. Let me say three. One is cross-cultural experience. I grew up in a pretty small town, fairly narrow experience, but with people who traveled a lot. So I kind of was exposed to a wider world, did a lot of reading as a kid, and mainly was swept up in the romantic way of seeing things that the teenage boys' books were tending to do. But nonetheless, there was something over the horizon that was immensely appealing. My own experience of what I have learned and continue to learn from past intercultural experiences has, every once in a while, I have these little aha moments that go back quite some time. Little epiphanies. I love the word epiphany, this sort of suddenly awakening to a greater depth of understanding about the way the world works and how I work in it. So cross-culture can be huge, and I can talk forever about my own experiences there, but there's such great literature being written these days. The second thing is, so that's an external practice, going out and seeing the world.
Learning
and if
from
you
others.
can, what?
Learning from others.
And the great skill then becomes listen, learn, then ask more questions so that you can get beyond your preliminary learning, which it's often learning within your box, and you
Mhm.
only know that, oh, there's a door out of here someplace because they're talking about another box.
Mhm.
And um,
And if I could intersect also from a design perspective there too, another component of that would be to objective observation. So trying to consciously be more aware of our biases and judgments that we might jump to when meeting new people or new ideas, so that we can really objectively learn something new and expand our own understanding.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where listening comes in.
Mhm.
Listening as not only an act of hearing, but an act of patience
Mhm.
and humility in the best sense of the word.
Yeah.
It's, you know, I don't understand everything. And I certainly don't understand what's going on in this other person's mind. So I better listen and see how much I can get into it.
Mhm.
It's the contemporary phrase I hear a lot is theory of mind. We all have a theory of what's going on in the other person's mind, but we don't actually know.
Mhm.
But we'll learn a lot more if we listen.
Yeah.
And we'll learn even more if we learn to ask good questions that let that person know, oh, this person actually is interested in me and what I am experiencing. And so I will open up a little bit more. And talk about getting inside another box, just that. Well, going along with that is the internal work
Right.
that I think mindfulness um, meditation practice is immensely helpful with. Um, I think journaling that of one kind or another can be a form of mindfulness practice. But I also think just learning to sit, watch your stream of consciousness, um, notice essentially who you move from place to place thinking you are. Here I am being worried. I am being angry. Here I am being hopeful. Um, but underneath that is a deeper you. Um, and you may get below the levels of anxiety that you feel. I love the theologian Teilhard de Chardin, a paleontologist who is also a Jesuit priest, talks about in one of his books, I think it's called The Phenomenon of Man. I'm sure he'd update the title these days. But he talks about how here he was, years as a monk, years as a scientist, and one day his whole approach to doing meditation changed, that meditation and prayer. And he took a contemplative approach, just looking at the layers of consciousness that he could peel off. And he kept going deeper and deeper until he describes he came to a point at the depth, at a great depth within his own self, where at his feet, was emerging a spring, essentially the spirit of life, the spring, a source of life, beyond which he knew he wouldn't penetrate, but which he knew was empowering him to be a caring and creative person.
Mhm.
And I think that's the mindfulness journey that the Japanese will speak of it as satori, and the Buddhist tradition, enlightenment. Um, um, I think in Christianity, salvation can be almost used for that kind of experience. It's that um, epiphany that in the Christian tradition, 40 days after, I said, no, I guess it's the 12th night of Christmas. That's Epiphany. It's the wise people coming to the place where Jesus is, out of the manger in a house by this time. Um, and they're seeing this new life. And this is why this is what the star has led them to. And suddenly it's like, oh yeah, this is what it's all about. This is the potential of humankind right in front of us. Um, and it was like a grand awakening. They
Mhm.
maybe came with actually even military purposes in mind, because they were coming from Persia, which was essentially a former conqueror and emperor and empire that the Romans were in opposition to. So they were in enemy territory. But suddenly seeing, they just turned around and went back because they'd seen everything they needed to know. We don't need to conquer another empire. We know that we need to conquer the barriers to human spiritual growth. We saw it right there in that baby with loving parents. That, I think, is what can happen to us through mindfulness practice. We look inward and see a new depth of meaning to our lives and a new understanding of who we are. But that opens our mind to who everybody else is too.
And I love that you also included creativity in that with one of your descriptions, because that's something that I've heard a lot recently that I think is so interesting. Of if you find yourself kind of feeling stuck or frustrated or anxious, and there doesn't seem like there's as many options around or ways of seeing things, that's kind of a sign that you may be in your thoughts, right? Of that feeling like I am my thoughts, versus if you can practice mindfulness meditation and learn to really start almost like switch over to that just state of awareness and being that part of you that's observing your thoughts, aware of your thoughts, that it almost opens up this space, this creative space, because you're not tied to these kind of, I think one way you put it is like these heavier thoughts, these heavier notions. And you can kind of move into this lighter space of possibility, which really opens us up to so much creativity.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think a follow-up question that I would have, and I'm sure a lot of other people might have this too, okay, so I am practicing getting into a place of awareness. I'm practicing kind of learning to switch over to this space of openness and observation. How do I start to incorporate that, back into my day-to-day life? One word I've heard with you was intentionality. I don't know if that kind of strikes a chord or if that's a good place to kind of touch on it.
Well,
there.
I think intention is developed through a practice like meditation. I am going to look at how my mind works. And I think that a traditional but also contemporary approach is learning to make a distinction in your own mind between stimulus and response. And not only a distinction, but a pause between, rather than stimulation and reaction, which usually is instantaneous coming out of the brain stem. You condition yourself to say, okay, wait a minute, let me take a deep breath, let me count to 10. Let me count to 10 mindfully, and get relaxed enough to look at how I want to respond as opposed to react. And when you're in that pause period, which you can get to a point where you can decide how long am I going to pause. I've counted to 10, but you know what? I think I'd be better off doing 10 minutes or walking around the block before I respond. And then you actually have a response, building on the idea of responsibility. You never feel quite responsible for your reaction. You just struck out. And that you just say, oh, it was instinctual. I'm not really to blame. Everybody does that. But if you do the pause, you start to see you have more options. That's when the creativity usually doesn't occur with somebody coming up with something entirely new that's not already in their head. It's rather the options come up and the options start to play together and something new emerges from that. That's the creative part. But it's still Picasso with a paintbrush and a bunch of ideas in his mind. Am I going to be cubist today, or am I going to be realist today? Am I going to capture the spirit better with a blue mood, or am I going to go Van Gogh with yellow everywhere? I mean, a Picasso knows all of those choices as he stands in front of the easel. A Mary Oliver, as she looks at a blank sheet of paper with her pen in hand, she she's letting her imagination do the work of putting together what she knows in new ways.
Mhm.
Um, that's when she becomes responsible, but she also becomes liberated from just reaction. So
Right.
I think that is an important part of it.
Mhm.
And consulting with other people, I think, is huge. So when people start dialoguing and talking and sharing, that there's a richness that emerges that is, I think, part of spiritual growth.
Mhm. I love that too. And to kind of go back, if we could just go back really quickly too, because something that you touched on before talking about community, you were talking about intentionality and kind of that idea of the blank canvas and being creating with intention rather than just reacting to what was going on around us. I'd love to just touch on that really quickly, that I kind of had an aha moment there when you were describing that, because to me, that's one of the really great benefits of this concept of life design, or where you're kind of thinking through and getting intentional of like, what is the bigger picture mission here? What is my North Star that I'm working towards? Even if I don't have it all figured out, it's not all, I don't have a step-by-step process maybe, but I've taken the time to get intentional of what matters to me and what I want to kind of build and work towards.
Mm-hmm.
Then all of a sudden, we do feel like we have more power not to react in a certain way. So if something's frustrating at work and we're inclined to just leave that job, we might take a step back and say, actually, I'm not going to react that way because bigger picture, I know what I'm working towards.
Yeah,
And I have some autonomy and power over these day-to-day decisions I make to be able to work towards that.
absolutely. Yeah.
So I know we're discussing kind of this having ministry and development by design, and so a lot of that came up was kind of the working with the human design, right? And so where that intersects with kind of spiritual growth, personal growth, contributing to community development and growth. And one thing I've heard you talk a lot about that you brought up earlier was this idea of developmental psychology or behavioral psychology, and just how powerful, how powerful we are. The more we understand our minds, to see how much influence we can have on our minds and these really powerful tool that is our brain. So to kind of wrap it up there, how would you kind of include that maybe in understanding the human design and understanding how that kind of contributes to spiritual and personal growth?
I don't know if I were just to try and draw a little quick conclusion on
Yeah.
that, and if I were talking to myself, I would say, at this point in your life, what do you really think is most important?
Mhm.
And what value does that speak to? I might take that into my own meditation practice and focus on that value. What people call Diotima's ladder of love. It's from Plato's Symposium, in which Socrates is talking about his teacher, Diotima. Some people think she's a fictional character, but a lot of others think Plato didn't really include fictional people in his dialogue, so she probably represents somebody real, maybe a priestess in Greece, or maybe in fact the wife of one of the great kings of Greece, who was known as a very wise woman. She says, okay, you're going to start as a baby or a person capable of saying, I love this person, I love my mother, I love, and I know by the time I'd hit third grade, a little girl walked across the playground and immediately I was head over heels in love with her, just, like a real person. Um, um,
Been there.
but that Diotima then takes us through 7 stages of growing from loving an individual being for their physical beauty, their appearance, to loving lots of people for their just appreciating the beauty of humankind and the world, then moving inward and asking you to appreciate the beauty of virtue, and appreciate it, find it in some person, and really just deepen your sense of how special that is. And then notice that there's a number of people that have profound virtue about their character. And then after a while, realize that the soul is the same essence in everybody. So everybody has the potential for virtue, and ultimately fall sufficiently in love with the essence of virtue that you start to realize, I've got that too.
Mhm.
And I can work on that. I can be a person who the beauty of my internal soul, internal soul, my internal being, is 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 super valuable, just like everybody else's. And I'll end up being a very virtuous person. It, I think we can find models like that out in the world, that give us a path. Um, but in the short run, to simply say, what's really important to me today?
Mhm.
I'm seeing it in my journal. I'm seeing it in my meditation. I'm seeing it in my worries as I ride the subway to the office. I'm seeing it in what my loved one and I are fighting over, or what we're hoping, dreaming of. Let me go deep into that and see, sort of like Teilhard de Chardin, the monk, what is really there in the depths. I think Brian Swim, a physicist who does a lot of thinking about what does the physical world of science mean, in terms of human values. We can start any place. We can start, as a number of wonderful writers have done recently, with the life of trees. What does the life of a tree, much less the life of a orangutan or early hominid, tell us about who we are? Huge amounts about our potentials,
Mhm.
and a lot of excitement once we realize, once we get out of that box of thinking I'm just me, to thinking, wow, there's a lot of me I don't know yet.
Yeah.
um, um,
And to kind of
and it can be good.
hmm And to put some words or kind of phrases to that concept, I'll just circle around to a couple that you brought up earlier on in the conversation when you were talking about kind of the newer research and studies and ways of thinking about our minds, and consciousness that have been coming out. So that concept of creative power, creative insight. A phrase you said before was matter itself, or no, what did you say? You said matter
Uh,
informed with information.
uh,
So kind of around that concept of informed energy or information energy.
right,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think that's a really cool for someone who's kind of thinking, well, how I want to look into this idea of my potential more, and I want to see how can I get kind of connected to some of these concepts that he's talking about. I think that that's a neat way, one neat direction to go in terms of understanding this immense amount of intelligence that is available and creative power available to all of us.
Absolutely. I think the internal human design is very closely related, of course, with the communal design, because we survived early on by living in small communities, little tribes. Um, and there's an endless amount to learn about who we are in as individuals in the context of being part of a community. Uh,
Mhm.
a lot of stuff by E.O. Wilson about competition and cooperation, I think, is key. I um, I would point people in the direction, if they haven't read a book called The Blue Zones of Happiness by a guy named Buettner, Buettner, I think. Um, he is a National Geographic writer, who also works with a lot of, I think, United Nations data that is collected around the world. He did some of the original work on longevity and what leads to long lives. And he noticed, his research team noticed, that longevity was also connected with a sense of well-being and happiness. So they started to do research on where are the happiest people in the world and why did that happen to them. And it turns out intentionality has proven to be quite a large part of it, but intentional building, maintenance of friendship, connection. There's probably no other more important factor than having a supportive community that works together, and within that community, having a group of 3 to 5 dear friends, people you go through at that period of your life with in very, very close connection. People whom you trust, feel comfortable with, and have a history with.
Mm-hmm.
So those kinds of things, a supportive, wider community and an intensely caring, immediate community. But the Blue Sounds of Happiness really dwells on that. And some of the challenges, I think, are very important to be paying attention to. So like the Israeli historian Noah Harari, Yuval Noah Harari, wrote a book called 21 Issues for the 21st Century. It's not always optimistic, but it really does point some ways forward for individuals as well as communities and nations. And in fact, it's really interesting that he ends up his last chapter, and so does Buechner in Blue Sounds of Happiness, talking a lot about mindfulness practice, a lot about contemplation and meditation, because they really felt it goes hand in glove. You can have an extremely progressive, we're going to provide well-being kind of national political system, but if people aren't doing the developmental work on their own, you probably won't get a good fit.
Yeah, that's so powerful. That's such a great way to end.
Yeah, I think one final thought I'd toss in is the science is helping us see these things more clearly, but we've really known them for a long time. They just, I think there are systems that repress us as well as systems that liberate us. But even I remember, I believe it was Ben Franklin, I know he used to keep a regular journal, as many people in his era did. There were lots of wonderful journals from that time. But I think his basic structure for his journal was, in the morning, I write about what I hope for the day. In the evening, I write about how I did. And that's pretty cool as a spiritual practice.
Yeah.
Pretty cool.
Set intentions and then reflect on the learnings and outcomes.
Yeah.
Kind of.
And not get discouraged.
Yeah.
As a scientist, he was always willing to experiment, even with his own life.
So that leads me to the last question. No, then we've covered a lot, but the last question I like to ask everyone is, given this concept of designing for the future and getting intentional with how we impact those and work with those designs, my question to you is, what design do you have in mind?
I came across a wonderful line recently in a book. The question was raised, what is the most important thing? And the answer was, the most important thing is to remember the most important thing. That's really actually amazingly profound, because how easily the day will take away our intention. And for me, I think I'm just really aware these days of how much more there is to learn. And I'm really excited about that. So, I want to keep contributing to the well-being of the world. I really think for the current moment in America, working for democracy and excuse me, and equity. Those are the two big ones for us right now. Equity for so many different identity groups, but democracy for all of us, so we all have a say and felt heard. even if we don't prevail on any given day, we have the chance then to educate after that. So I think that's for me, to just keep paying attention to how I'm growing and to try and be as helpful to the world for how it's growing. That's my design.
Beautiful.
Yep.
Mhm.
I think
Thank
Ram Dass wrote a book some time ago called "How Can I Help?" And I think that's always a good way to start
Mhm.
the day.
Definitely. And I also like the idea of, in that question of how can I help, it leaves a lot of freedom for finding opportunities to help in a way that you might not even have in mind. The opportunity might present itself on a small scale, on your day-to-day commute, or it may be something much larger. Because I think the question that we ask here, what design do you have in mind, is a little bit more visual or kind of visionary in terms of what do you see, that what ideal or kind of blue sky or North Star do you imagine that you want to help work towards? But I also like that other way of just ask a continual question of how can I help? And so maybe it's a new way that you didn't even envision. Yeah.
Yep. How can I help? How can I hope? I suppose that's a good one too.
Love that. Well, thank you so much, Dad, Jack Donovan, for others. Thank you so much.